unaware she just signed a $1 billion deal. Husband serves wife divorce papers minutes after she burst twins. But he forgot to read the prenup. He didn't wait a day. He didn't wait an hour. He didn't even wait 15 minutes. Minutes after Grace Whitmore gave birth to twins, her body still bleeding, stitches fresh, hands shaking as she tried to hold both babies against her chest. Her husband walked into her hospital room with another woman at his side and a thick envelope in his hand. Daniel Whitmore didn't smile. He didn't touch his children. He looked straight at his wife and said in a cold, clear voice, "You're not my problem anymore. You've been dead weight for years, Grace." The nurse froze in the corner. Grace blinked, trying to focus, trying to understand. Her voice came out small. "Daniel, I just had your babies." He scoffed. "Don't start crying," he snapped. "You're a burden, a liability. You should be grateful anyone married you at all." By the door, his mother, Margaret, stared at Grace like she was dirt on the floor. "She planned this pregnancy to trap you," Margaret said loudly. "Go live like the poor woman you were before my son saved you." The other woman, Natalie, the mistress now standing where a wife should stand, watched with a faint smile. "For success, darling," she said softly to Grace. "Something you clearly don't understand." Grace's arms tightened around the tiny bodies pressed to her chest. On the tray beside her, the divorce papers waited. What Daniel didn't know was this. Just hours earlier, in a quiet consultation room down the hall, Grace had signed a different set of papers. A licensing deal that quietly valued her work at $1 billion. And buried in the prenup he once laughed at and never truly read, was a clause that would turn this moment against him in a way he never saw coming. Dear viewers, thank you for being here. If you watch without subscribing, it's like letting Grace's strength be ignored the way they ignored her in that hospital room. When you click that button, you stand with every woman who was humiliated at her weakest and still chose to rise. Please subscribe now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Grace Whitmore was 32 years old, 8 months pregnant with twins, and standing in her own kitchen as if she were waiting for permission to exist. The intensity came immediately sharp and suffocating. "Look at you," Margaret Whitmore said, her voice slicing through the room. "You've really let yourself go." Margaret Whitmore was Daniel's mother, 61, controlled, immaculately dressed, and used to being obeyed. She believed family was hierarchy, not love. From the first day Grace married her son, Margaret had made it clear. Grace was tolerated, not accepted. Grace froze. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, round and heavy beneath her dress. The twins shifted inside her, slow and uneasy, as if they felt what she was feeling. "Twins aren't an excuse," Margaret continued flatly. "A woman should still know her place. Pregnancy isn't permission to become careless." Grace didn't answer. A few steps away sat Daniel Whitmore, her husband of 6 years, 36. Ambitious, image-obsessed. He leaned back in his chair at the breakfast bar, eyes fixed on his phone, thumbs scrolling through emails, jaw tight with a permanent irritation he no longer tried to hide. He didn't look up. That silence hurt more than the insult. Daniel liked to tell people he had saved Grace, that she had been nothing special before him. That marriage had given her value. He said it often enough at dinners, at work events, sometimes even at home, until it became part of the story he told himself. Grace swallowed. She reminded herself this was temporary, that pregnancy made people harsh, that marriage required patience, that seasons changed. She had always believed sacrifice came back around. "Can you stop standing like that?" Daniel said suddenly, still not looking at her. "You're blocking the light." Grace turned slightly, confused. Don't start," he snapped. "You're always so emotional. It's exhausting." Margaret nodded approvingly like a teacher pleased with a student's answer. Grace felt something sink inside her chest. Not pain exactly, but weight, a familiar one. She turned toward the counter, pretending to search for something to clean, something to fix, something to make herself useful in a house she helped keep running, but had never truly been allowed to own. As she moved, her thoughts slipped backward, pulled into memory. Years earlier, Grace had been someone else. At 26, she had worked as a senior product strategist at a research firm. She was the one who stayed late, the one who fixed problems no one else understood. She didn't talk much about her work because she didn't need praise. Results were enough. That's where she met Daniel. He had been charming then. Curious, he asked questions about her work. Told her she was brilliant. He said she deserved more than being invisible in someone else's company. She believed him. What Daniel never told anyone, what he later erased, was that Grace didn't lose that career. She walked away from it voluntarily. 3 months after their engagement, Margaret had invited Grace to lunch. The restaurant had been quiet, elegant, uncomfortable. "You work too much," Margaret had said calmly. A wife who works forgets how to support her husband. Grace had hesitated. "I enjoy my work," she had replied carefully. Margaret smiled thin. "Practiced. Enjoyment is for hobbies," she said. "Marriage is about priorities." That night, Grace talked to a lawyer for the first time, Evelyn Ross. Evelyn had helped her negotiate her exit from the failing research firm and had quietly advised her to protect the algorithm she had been building there. "You have something valuable," Evelyn had said. "Don't give it away because someone tells you it's just work." Grace registered her intellectual property in her own name before she resigned. She didn't mention that part to Margaret. In the months before the wedding, after their engagement, but before they set a date, Grace met with Evelyn again. That was when the prenup came up. It was Grace's idea, not Daniel's. Evelyn drafted it before the marriage. Simple, clear, and signed by both of them long before the wedding ceremony. Anything Grace created before or during the marriage remained hers. No spousal claim, no shared ownership of her intellectual property, and a clause. Grace insisted on financial penalties and legal recourse if there was ever coercion, financial control, or abuse. Daniel had laughed when he saw it, skimmed it carelessly, and signed anyway. In the present, she wiped the counter slowly, feeling Daniel's eyes flick up now, assessing, not affectionate. "You know," he said, finally looking at her. "My colleagues keep asking why you never come to events anymore. It's embarrassing." Grace turned. "I'm 8 months pregnant," she said softly. "With twins," Daniel sighed. "Excuses," he muttered. "Other women manage," Margaret smirked. Grace said nothing. She had learned. Silence kept the peace, or at least delayed the explosion. No one in that room noticed. No one had ever asked how Grace lived quietly alongside them. In the small office upstairs, she kept a separate laptop. Always locked, always charged. It wasn't a secret because she was doing something wrong. It was separate because experience had taught her that some things were safe or out of reach. She still consulted occasionally on logistics problems for her former industry contacts. All legal, all through a personal company registered in her name years ago. No overlap with Daniel's finances. No joint signatures. She signed documents digitally using secure apps Evelyn had recommended. Daniel had once asked who kept calling. Grace had smiled and said, "Old work things." He never pressed. Now standing alone by the counter, Grace felt another small movement inside her. She placed both hands on her belly and closed her eyes. The room faded. The insults, the tension, the quiet cruelty. She leaned forward slightly and whispered, barely audible, "Mama will fix this," she said softly. "I promise." Daniel scoffed behind her. Margaret turned away, uninterested. On the table, half hidden beneath a magazine, Grace's phone lit up with a single unread notification from a secure email account Evelyn had set up for her. Grace didn't reach for it yet. She finished wiping the counter, put the cloth away, and forced herself to breathe. Because somewhere beneath the silence, something irreversible had already begun. And very soon, everything they thought they knew about her would collapse. The pain came suddenly, sharp, tight, unforgiving. Grace Whitmore gripped the edge of the hospital bed as another contraction rolled through her body, stronger than the last. Her breath caught. The room felt too small, too quiet, too empty. She was alone. Daniel had dropped her off an hour earlier after the obstetrician suggested she stay for monitoring. He stood at the foot of the bed for less than 5 minutes, checked his watch twice, and kissed her forehead like an obligation. "Text me if it gets serious," he'd said. "I have meetings this afternoon. I'll come back when it's time." Margaret had promised to check in later. They hadn't returned. Now, Grace sat under dim lights in a private consultation room just off the maternity ward, heart racing, hands trembling, not just from pain, but from the weight of everything pressing in at once. Then her phone vibrated. She flinched, thinking it might be Daniel, already annoyed, already distant. But the name on the screen stopped her breath completely. Evelyn Ross. Grace straightened slowly, wiping sweat from her forehead. Evelyn was more than just the lawyer who had drafted her prenup. She had been there the night Grace walked away from her old firm, the one who helped her protect the code she'd written when no one else believed it mattered. Evelyn wasn't family. She wasn't emotional. She never called unless it mattered, Grace answered. Yes, she whispered. Evelyn's voice was steady on the other end. Professional controlled paper rustled softly in the background. "It's done," Evelyn said. Grace's fingers tightened around the phone. "The licensing agreement is fully executed," Evelyn continued. "Global rollout approved. Final valuation confirmed by Vidian's board this morning." Grace had signed her part of the agreement in that same consultation room earlier that morning, hand trembling slightly as she scrolled her name on the tablet Evelyn's office had sent over. Vidian, the multinational logistics company Grace had been quietly negotiating with for nearly a year. The ones who had approached her after seeing what her algorithm could do in a small pilot. "You crossed 1 billion, Evelyn said. The number barely registered. Another contraction rolled through her so hard that the word billion blurred into background noise. Right now, survival felt more real than any valuation. That's their internal valuation of the technology. The first milestone payment is locked. Congratulations. And more importantly, you're officially protected." Grace closed her eyes. Not because she was overwhelmed with joy, but because for the first time in years, she felt something loosen inside her chest. Safety, not money safety, not status safety, legal safety. Another contraction hit and Grace inhaled slowly, grounding herself as Evelyn kept speaking. "The corporate counsel signed off 20 minutes ago." Evelyn said, "Your company retains ownership of the code. Vidian only licenses it. No matter what happens in your marriage, this deal is untouchable. It's in your name alone, consistent with the prenup." Grace nodded, even though Evelyn couldn't see her. "Thank you," Grace said quietly. "Grace," Evelyn added, her tone shifting just slightly. "I saw your missed call from last night. If something is happening at home, document everything. You already know this, but I'm reminding you. The prenup's abuse clause is enforceable. Don't let them bully you into signing anything in your current condition." Grace's throat tightened. "I understand." She ended the call just as the pain faded into a dull ache. The room went silent again, and with that silence came memory. Years earlier, long before pregnancy, before cruelty became routine, Grace had been working late in an empty office, staring at lines of code that no one else at the firm seemed to understand. She had noticed inefficiencies in logistics systems that cost companies millions each year, patterns no one bothered to question. So, she built something better, a proprietary algorithm, clean, adaptive, quietly powerful. At first, it was just a side project. Then it became more. When the firm began to collapse under bad leadership, Grace made a choice. She reclaimed what was hers legally. Her work, her idea, her creation. She registered it under her own name, protected it, refined it slowly while life moved forward around her. She never told Daniel the full scope, not because she was hiding something wrong, but because she had been warned. Margaret's voice echoed in her memory. "Men get threatened by women with options," Margaret had said years ago over tea. "If you want peace, don't make him feel small." Grace had listened. She had always listened. The prenup had been Grace's idea, too. Evelyn had insisted on specific language. Anything Grace created before or during the marriage remained hers. Any attempt by a spouse to transfer, conceal, or control her intellectual property triggered automatic financial penalties and immediate grounds to seek separate accounts and protection. Daniel had shrugged and signed, convinced he would always be the one holding the power. Now sitting in a hospital room with her body preparing to split open to bring life into the world, Grace placed a hand on her stomach and breathed through another wave of discomfort. The twins shifted inside her. She whispered, barely audible, "I won't let them inherit silence." The door opened briefly. A nurse peeked in, checking the monitor, offering a polite smile before leaving again. Grace was alone once more. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message notification. Not from Daniel, not from family. A secure confirmation email unread. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Another contraction surged stronger now. More urgent. Grace pressed the call button for assistance. Her breathing steady, her face calm. The nurse returned with the obstetrician. They spoke to her gently, explaining that her labor was progressing faster than expected. The operating room was being prepped just in case. Somewhere else in the building, Daniel was still unaware, still scrolling, still confident, still believing he held all the power. Grace lay back against the pillow, eyes focused on the ceiling as the nurse adjusted the four. "It's time," the nurse said softly. Grace nodded. As she was wheeled down the hallway, her phone slipped slightly on the bed beside her, screen lighting up one last time. The subject line glowed briefly before the screen dimmed. Confirmation. Final licensing agreement. Executed. Daniel never saw it. And in just minutes, he would make the decision that would destroy everything he thought he controlled. He just didn't know it yet. It had been barely 15 minutes since the twins were born when the room changed. The first cry had barely faded when the door opened. Grace Whitmore lay on the hospital bed, drenched in sweat, her body shaking from pain and exhaustion. Her arms trembled as she held her newborn twins against her chest, one wrapped in a pale blanket, the other tucked close beneath her chin. Their tiny faces were red and wrinkled, eyes closed, mouths searching blindly for comfort. She was stitched, sore, exhausted, but she was smiling. For one fragile moment, nothing else existed. Then the door opened hard. Daniel Whitmore walked in first. He didn't rush. He didn't smile. He didn't move toward the babies. He looked annoyed. Behind him stepped Natalie Reed, the woman Grace had seen only once before at a company dinner. Introduced as a consultant, Natalie was in her early 30s, polished, confident, dressed too well for a maternity floor. Her hair was perfect, her expression calm, possessive. She stood where a wife should stand. Grace's heart stuttered. A second later, Margaret Whitmore entered behind them, chin lifted, lips pressed tight with satisfaction. Daniel's mother didn't look at Grace first. Her eyes went straight to the baby's cold, appraising, detached before flicking back up to the room, assessing who was watching. A nurse stood at the monitor, chart in hand. She froze as the energy shifted. Grace tightened her arms around the twins instinctively. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice thin and confused. What is she doing here?" Daniel ignored the question. He stepped closer to the bed and placed a thick manila envelope onto the rolling tray beside Grace's arm. The sound of it hitting the metal surface felt louder than it should have. "Final. You're not my problem anymore," Daniel said flatly. "You've been dead weight for years." The words didn't make sense at first. Grace stared at him, her mind slow, foggy from medication and shock. She looked down at the envelope, then back at his face. "I just gave birth," she said quietly. "They're still." Natalie leaned in slightly, her voice soft, almost gentle. "For success, darling," Natalie said. "Something you wouldn't understand." She smiled as she said it, like she was delivering a line she had rehearsed. Grace's breath caught. Margaret scoffed from the foot of the bed. "She planned this pregnancy to trap you," Margaret said loud enough that the nurse flinched. "Disgusting." Grace shook her head weakly. "That's not Daniel, please." She tried to sit up, panic, cutting through the exhaustion. The movement sent pain ripping through her abdomen. She gasped. The nurse instinctively stepped forward. "Sir, she just came out of surgery," the nurse said carefully. "She needs rest." This isn't. Margaret turned her head slowly and stared at the nurse. This is a private family matter, Margaret said. You're not needed right now. The nurse hesitated, glancing at Grace. Grace managed a small shake of her head, not because she didn't want help, but because she knew what confrontation with Margaret would look like. Not here. Not with her babies in her arms. The nurse lingered by the door, unwilling to leave completely. Daniel didn't help Grace sit up. He didn't ask how she felt. Don't embarrass me, he snapped. I need you to sign these so we can both move on. He tapped the envelope. Grace stared at it. Divorce papers, Daniel said as if announcing a delivery. My lawyer already filed. This is just your acknowledgement. Grace looked down at her children. They were warm, real, alive. Her hands were still shaking as she adjusted the blanket around them, shielding them instinctively from the tension in the room. Why now? She whispered. Why here? Daniel exhaled sharply, irritated. You've always been a burden, he said. Always emotional, always in the way. I'm done carrying you. Natalie nodded, satisfied. You should be grateful, Natalie added. Not every woman gets clarity this early. Grace felt something inside her crack. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. She had given him years. She had given up her career. She had given birth to his children. And this was how he chose to end it. Her arms tightened around the twins again. Margaret clicked her tongue. Stop clinging, she said. You're making a scene. Grace didn't answer. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just stared at the envelope. Then at the blank signature lines she could see through the translucent flap. Daniel shifted impatiently. Sign it, he repeated. Or this gets uglier. Lawyers. Depositions. You're not built for that. Grace swallowed hard. The room was silent except for the soft breathing of the babies. Then her phone buzzed on the bed beside her elbow. Once the sound cut through everything, Grace flinched. Daniel reacted instantly. He reached over and knocked the phone aside without even looking at it. It slid across the sheet and stopped near the edge of the mattress. Screen lighting up briefly before dimming again. No one saw the subject line. Confirmation. Final licensing agreement executed. Grace didn't reach for it. She looked at Daniel instead. I'm not signing anything right now, she said, voice barely above a whisper, but steadier than before. I just had surgery. My lawyer will review it. Daniel's eyes flashed. You don't have a lawyer, he said. You have me. Or you did. Grace held his gaze. I do, she said quietly. I've had one for years. For the first time, Daniel hesitated. The nurse shifted her weight, stepping closer to the bed again. I'm documenting this conversation, the nurse said carefully. It's hospital policy when legal documents are brought into a post-op room. Margaret turned on her sharply. You people and your policies. Daniel cut her off with a small gesture. He could feel control slipping and didn't understand why. He grabbed the envelope, shoved it back into his briefcase, and snapped it shut. This isn't over, he said. He turned and walked out. Natalie followed him, heels clicking softly on the floor. Margaret lingered a moment longer, eyes cold. You brought this on yourself, she said. Then she left. The door closed. Grace was alone again, holding 2 newborn lives against her chest, pain pulsing through her body. The nurse moved quickly now, adjusting the blankets, checking the 4, her professionalism returning. I'm so sorry, the nurse said quietly. Do you want me to note everything that just happened? Grace nodded once, unable to trust her voice. The nurse tapped the tablet, documenting. Outside the room, voices faded. Inside, something else awakened. Grace lowered her forehead to the twins' heads and closed her eyes. Very soon, everything Daniel thought he had ended would only just begin. The card reader beeped once, then again, then a third time, louder, sharper, final, declined. 3 days after giving birth, Grace Whitmore stood at the hospital pharmacy counter, her body still sore, her arms heavy as she held one twin while the other slept in a carrier at her feet. The discharge nurse had given her a list of medications to fill before she left. The clerk shifted awkwardly, eyes flicking to the babies, then back to the screen. "I'm sorry," the clerk said softly. "It says the account is closed." Grace felt heat rush to her face. "That can't be right," she said, her voice calm but thin. "We've used that card for years. Please try again." The clerk did the same answer behind Grace through the glass doors. Daniel's car idled in the patient pickup lane. He sat in the driver's seat, sunglasses on, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. In the passenger seat, Natalie Reed scrolled through her phone, lips curved in a small pleased smile. Natalie had insisted on coming along when Daniel picked Grace up. "It'll be easier," she'd said. "I can help you carry things while Grace recovers." "Now." She leaned out the open window slightly when she saw Grace turned back toward the counter. "She spends too much," Natalie said loudly, not bothering to lower her voice. "She'll have to learn to budget." People turned. Grace tightened her grip on the baby, feeling the familiar mix of shame and disbelief. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope of emergency cash she had kept for years. Money she'd set aside quietly from small consulting payments long before the licensing deal. She paid the clerk without looking at anyone. Outside, she started recording on her phone before she reached the car. The camera angled down at her feet, the audio clear. "What happened?" Daniel asked as she opened the back door slowly. "The card was declined," Grace said, easing into the seat with a wheeze. "They said the account was closed." Daniel shrugged, putting the car into gear. "I moved everything," he said. "Joint accounts are a liability in a divorce. My lawyer advised it. You canceled our medical card while I was still admitted." Grace said softly, "You're covered under my insurance," he replied. "Stop being dramatic." Natalie smirked, eyes still on her phone. Grace said nothing. She pressed her phone deeper into the diaper bag, letting it keep recording. When they reached the house Daniel had bought 2 years into the marriage, the one he liked to call his, the intensity returned hard and immediate. 2 men stood at the gate. Security. They wore dark uniforms from the private company that patrolled the neighborhood and avoided Grace's eyes. Daniel pulled up, rolled down the window. "Afternoon," one guard said carefully. "We received new access instructions." Grace frowned. "What instructions?" she asked. The guard swallowed. "Ma'am," he said, "we've been told your name was removed from the primary access list. You're not authorized to enter the property without Mr. Whitmore present." Grace blinked. "I live here," she said slowly. "My children live here." "Not for long," came a voice from the front steps. Margaret Whitmore appeared at the door like a commander surveying a battlefield. She didn't look at Grace. She looked at the guards. "Follow the instructions you were given," Margaret said. "Only Mr. For Whitmore and approved guests are allowed through without clearance." Natalie slipped past them, keys to the front door already in her hand. Grace opened the car door, moving carefully, pain flaring through her abdomen as she stepped out with the twin carrier. "Daniel," she said, "I just had surgery. I need my things. The baby's things. Their cribs." Daniel avoided her eyes. "You'll have what you need," he said. "We'll send essentials to wherever you're staying." "This is simpler." "I wasn't told I was staying anywhere else," Grace said. Margaret smiled thinly. "You'll manage," she said. "You managed before my son saved you." Inside, the house moved quickly without Grace. Drawers open, closets emptied, suitcases dragged across floors. Grace stood at the gate, the twins fussing softly while her life was sorted without her input. One of Daniel's siblings, his younger brother Evan, late 20s, always quiet, stood near the walkway. He watched, hands in pockets, saying nothing. Another sibling, Lena, leaned against the railing, eyes fixed on her phone, pretending not to listen. No one defended Grace. No one asked questions. Grace shifted the weight of the carrier and pulled out her phone with her free hand, keeping it low, the screen dark. The audio app she'd opened at the pharmacy was still running. "Ma'am, do you have somewhere to go tonight?" one of the guards asked quietly when Margaret stepped back inside. Grace nodded, though she didn't. "Not yet." "Yes," she said. "I'll manage." She wouldn't tell them that her somewhere would be a small furnished rental Evelyn had mentioned once. Just in case. Natalie reappeared at the doorway wearing Grace's robe, the one Grace wore every morning. Natalie smiled, turning slightly, admiring herself in the reflection of the glass. "So, this is where we'll live," she said casually. Daniel didn't correct her. Grace felt something detach inside her. Not her heart, but something colder. Something that watched instead of felt. Her phone buzzed in her hand. "Evelyn," Grace answered. "Are you safe?" Evelyn asked. "No greeting. No small talk." "Not here," Grace replied. "Go to the address I texted you yesterday." Evelyn said, "The short-term rental. I booked it in your name. We'll deal with the house legally. Don't argue with them right now." Grace glanced at the gate cameras, the guards, the open front door where her robe now hung on someone else's shoulders. "I have the babies," she said. "I know," Evelyn replied. "That's why I'm telling you not to stand in a driveway arguing with people who want you destabilized. Get somewhere stable. Then we move." Later that night, after she settled the twins and borrowed bassinets in the small rental apartment Evelyn had arranged, Grace received another message. Margaret was hosting a small family gathering and expected Grace to be there to discuss terms like an adult. Evelyn replied first. "Go," she texted, and record everything. Grace arrived slowly, exhausted, carrying the twins. The room felt quiet when she entered. Margaret glanced at the chair beside Daniel at the long dining table. "Remove that," she said sharply. A cousin hesitated, then picked it up and carried it away. Grace stood. "She doesn't belong here," Margaret said loud enough for everyone to hear. "She never did." A phone lifted on the far side of the room. Grace saw the screen glowing, angled toward her. Recording. Daniel didn't look at her. Natalie sat where Grace should have been, one hand resting on Daniel's knee. Grace shifted her weight, pain flaring through her abdomen, but she didn't ask to sit. She didn't ask for anything. She watched. She noticed the way Natalie handled papers, financial documents casually flipping through them. Confident. She noticed Daniel's banking notifications lighting up on his phone, and the way he tilted the screen just enough for Natalie to see. She noticed everything. No one spoke to Grace directly. She was there but invisible. When the gathering ended, Grace stood near the doorway, preparing to leave. Natalie walked past her and kissed Daniel. Slow, deliberate, territorial in Grace's former living room. Grace didn't cry. She didn't react. She memorized. The way Daniel leaned into it. The way Margaret watched with approval. The way the security guard logged the time at the gate as she left again with her children. As Grace stepped outside, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't check it yet, but she knew without knowing how that everything being taken from her was being documented somewhere else. Quietly, and soon very quietly, the people who erased her would learn what it meant to leave a trail. Because what they thought was the end was only evidence being born. The door closed behind Grace with a soft click. For a moment, the sound felt louder than it should have. Final, deliberate, controlled. She stood still, one hand resting on the handle, breathing through the ache in her body. Every movement still reminded her of what she had been through. Surgery, blood loss, sleepless nights, but her grip was steady. The twins slept in their carrier beside her, tiny chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. This was the first quiet she had known in days that wasn't filled with someone else's voice. Grace stepped into the office. It was small, neutral, no personal touches, just a table, 3 chairs, and a large window that let in afternoon light. The kind of place where decisions were made carefully with more facts than emotion. At the table sat Evelyn Ross. Evelyn rose when Grace entered. Mid-40s, dressed simply, eyes sharp and alert. She had represented Grace for years, first for her intellectual property, then for the prenup, and now inevitably for this. "You made it," Evelyn said. Grace nodded and sat down slowly, lowering herself into the chair beside the twins. She adjusted the blanket around them before looking up again. Evelyn didn't rush her. She laid out a thick folder and began spreading documents across the table. Bank statements, legal notices, printed screenshots, security access logs. They move faster than I expected, Evelyn said. But they also made more mistakes than I expected. Grace leaned forward slightly. Evelyn pointed to the first page. Financial control, she said. Your cards were canceled while you were hospitalized and your access to the marital home was removed without any court order. That's documented, time-stamped. Violates both standard marital rights and the abuse clause in your prenup. She slid another page forward. Unauthorized transfers, Evelyn continued. Marital funds moved to Natalie Reed's personal account labeled as consulting fees. No contract, no deliverables, no approval from you despite your prenup requiring mutual consent for large transfers. Grace nodded once. Evelyn placed a third document down. Coercion, she said. Divorce papers brought into a post-operative room, witnessed by a nurse. The hospital has already confirmed they have an incident report on file. Grace's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed even. They didn't hide it, she said quietly. They thought they didn't have to. Evelyn studied her for a moment before speaking again. You were right to save everything. Grace reached into her bag and placed her phone on the table. She unlocked it, then slid it toward Evelyn. The screen filled with files, videos, photos, audio clips, security footage of the gate guard telling her she was no longer authorized to enter. A recording of Margaret insisting she never belonged here. Natalie's comment at the pharmacy about learning to budget. Daniel admitting he moved everything out of the joint account. Grace watched Evelyn scroll. She didn't look away. They thought silence meant weakness. Grace said it didn't. There was a knock at the door. A man stepped inside briefly. Early 40s, plain clothes, alert eyes. This is Mark Hale, Evelyn said. Private investigator. He verified the digital evidence and pulled independent logs. Mark nodded to Grace. We've cross-checked everything. He said, security records match your footage. Gate logs, transaction times, staff statements, it all lines up. And one more thing, Daniel and Natalie set up a shell company 3 months ago. Reed Whitmore Analytics. No real product, just a name that looks close enough to your field to raise eyebrows. Grace's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. They plan to present your algorithm as theirs if they could get access, Mark said. Vidian flagged the attempted contact from therein. They forwarded the emails. Vidian already sees them as a risk, Evelyn added. That helps you a lot. Grace met Mark's gaze. Is it enough? She asked. Mark didn't hesitate. Yes. He stepped back out, closing the door quietly behind him. The room settled again. Grace leaned back in her chair, finally allowing herself to breathe. The twins stirred softly, then went still. She looked down at them. For the first time since the hospital. Her eyes softened. This isn't about hurting him, she said. It's about ending it. Evelyn nodded and making sure it can't be rewritten. Grace lifted her head. They erased me, she said. I want the truth seen. Evelyn gathered the papers into a neat stack. Daniel's petition for divorce is already filed, she said. We're filing a counter-petition and a motion for protective orders today. With this, the court will see the pattern clearly. Financial abuse, coercion, attempts to interfere with your work. Grace exhaled. And the deal, she asked with Vidian untouched. Evelyn replied. Their legal team has already sent a letter confirming the IP is solely yours. Once this goes public, they'll lean into the narrative of backing the woman who built it, not the man who tried to profit off it. Grace looked back at the carrier. The twins slept on, unaware of contracts or courts or betrayal. They won't grow up thinking this is normal, she said. Evelyn's voice softened. No, she said. They won't. Outside, the afternoon lights shifted across the floor. Inside, the women at the table organized facts, dates, evidence, not noise, strategy. They wanted you small and dependent, Evelyn said quietly. You're neither. We'll let the law say that out loud. Grace nodded. Then let's start. Because silence had done its job. It had recorded. It had gathered. It had survived. Now it was ready to speak. A few days later, once everything had been pulled into a clean sequence. The first video started playing without sound. Grace Whitmore leaned forward instinctively, her body tense, eyes fixed on the laptop screen. The twins slept beside her in their carrier on the office floor. Tiny hands curled into fists, unaware that their mother was watching the truth assemble itself piece by piece. On the screen, a hospital pharmacy counter, a timestamp in the corner. 3 days after delivery, 10:14 a.m. Evelyn Ross stood behind Grace, arms folded, voice steady. "That's the exact minute," Evelyn said. "Your primary joint account was shut down." Grace didn't speak. She watched herself on the screen, pale, slow-moving, holding a newborn while a red decline flashed across the terminal. Another file opened. Bank records clean, precise. Marital funds transferred out in 3 large amounts in the 48 hours before and after delivery. The recipient name repeated each time. Natalie Reed Consulting, labeled as consulting expenses. Evelyn said, "No contract, no work product, no disclosure to you." "That's not consulting. That's siphoning." Grace nodded once. Her face remained calm, but her fingers curled slowly into her palm. The private investigator, Mark Hale, adjusted the laptop angle and clicked to the next clip. "This one came from the house security system," he said. "Cloud backup. You were still living there when this was recorded." The video began. The kitchen. Margaret Whitmore stood by the sink, sleeves rolled up, face set with purpose. She poured dark, dirty mop water into a bucket, stirring it with a handle. Daniel stood beside her, tense. "She needs to learn respect," Margaret said. "Take the clean bucket away and give her this. Do it now before she thinks she still belongs here." The camera angle shifted slightly as a housekeeper stepped into frame, looking uncomfortable. "Ma'am, she's pregnant," the housekeeper said quietly. "The doctor told her not to." Margaret cut her off. "Then she can sit and watch as we go through her things," she said. "Either way, she'll understand this isn't her home." The clip ended. The room was silent. Evelyn lowered herself into the chair across from Grace. "This isn't just unkind," Evelyn said. "This shows a pattern. Humiliation control. You were pregnant with twins when this was recorded. The timestamp puts it at 6 months." Grace stared at the blank screen. For years, she had been told to endure, to stay quiet, to make things easier. Now, silence was finally speaking for her. Mark placed another file on the table. Former staff came forward once her counterpetition was filed. He said they were afraid of losing their jobs before. Now they're not. These are their statements. He slid over written declarations, short, factual, unemotional. Grace read them slowly. Dates, orders, witness behavior. One line stood out. "Mr. Whitmore instructed us not to acknowledge Mrs. Whitmore's presence in front of guests." One statement read, "He said it would confuse the hierarchy." Grace's throat tightened. Evelyn tapped the next folder. "There's more," she said. Grace looked up. Evelyn opened it carefully, revealing photographs taken by fire inspectors from the security company that maintained the house's alarm system. Burnt paper fragments, charred edges, part of an envelope seal. A sealed legal letter, Evelyn said, destroyed in the Whitmore kitchen trash 3 weeks before the birth. Grace's eyes sharpened. That letter, Evelyn continued, was the original hard copy from Vidian's legal department, confirming your exclusive ownership of the algorithm and the valuation metrics they used. Their office sent it by courier and got a delivery confirmation. It never reached you. Mark nodded. The housekeeper reported a fancy legal letter arriving that day, he said. She says Natalie picked it up and said, "This doesn't matter anymore." And then later she saw burnt paper in the trash. The fire inspector confirmed the remains are consistent with the courier stationery. Grace inhaled slowly. Natalie hadn't just humiliated her. She had tried to erase proof of Grace's ownership before the deal was finalized. Grace reached into her bag and removed a slim folder of her own. She placed it gently on the table. "I kept digital backups," she said. "Emailed versions, scanned drafts. Vidian's counsel resent everything to my secure account." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I assumed you did." The videos continued. A nurse's incident report from the hospital. Daniel delivering divorce documents to a post-operative room. Margaret ordering the nurse to leave. Grace clearly stating she would not sign without her lawyer. Gate logs from the house. Grace's access removed on the same day. Daniel texted his lawyer about getting her out before she realizes what we moved. And then another layer. This is where it gets interesting, Mark said, opening one more file. Daniel's workplace. A series of emails flashed on the screen. Daniel and Natalie using company emails and letterhead pitching Reed Whitmore Analytics to Vidian as a streamlined solution for logistics optimization. They attached vague descriptions, no working prototype, but the language mirrored Grace's early pitch decks almost word for word. They tried to get a separate meeting. Mark said Vidian's general counsel flagged it as a conflict and forwarded everything to Evelyn. Evelyn didn't hide her satisfaction. They thought you were alone. She said. You weren't. Grace watched it all with a strange calm. She wasn't reliving pain. She was mapping it. At one point, Mark looked up from his notes. We've already turned this over to a forensic accountant, he said. The court will see the money trail. The regulators will see the attempted shell company. Your prenup's abuse provisions will hold. Grace glanced down at her children again. She adjusted the blanket around them, smoothing it carefully. They won't grow up thinking this is normal, she said. Evelyn's voice softened. No, she said. They won't. The sun dipped lower outside the window, casting long shadows across the office floor. Mark closed his laptop. We have enough, he said simply. Evelyn nodded. More than enough, she echoed. From this point forward, we don't just defend, we set the record. Grace looked at her reflection in the dark laptop screen. This was supposed to be quiet, she said. He wanted me to disappear. Evelyn met her gaze. Do you want this to end quietly? She asked. Or do you want the truth on record where it can't be spun later? Grace didn't answer right away. She watched the twins breathe, the rise and fall of their tiny chests. Then she nodded. We go public, she said. And somewhere, not yet aware, Daniel was still standing on ground that was already breaking beneath him. He just hadn't felt it move yet. The courtroom doors swung open with a sharp echo. Weeks had passed since Grace left the house. Enough time for filings, responses, and arguments on paper. Not enough time for Daniel to understand what he was walking into. Daniel Whitmore walked in first. His posture was confident, shoulders back, chin lifted like a man who believed he still owned the room. He wore a tailored suit, expensive watch, polished shoes. He looked calm, almost bored. At his side sat Natalie Reed, legs crossed neatly, nails perfect, lips curved into a controlled half-smile. She scanned the courtroom as if it were just another meeting she expected to win. Behind them, Margaret Whitmore took her seat, spine straight, eyes cold. She leaned toward Daniel and whispered without concern for anyone else hearing. She'll fold, Margaret said. She always does. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. He believed her. Then the room shifted. Grace Whitmore entered last. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She walked in slowly, carefully, her posture calm, her face composed. She wore a simple dress. No jewelry meant to impress. She wasn't trying to look powerful. She already was. The press noticed first. Then the observers. A low murmur moved through the room as Grace took her seat beside Evelyn Ross, her lawyer. Daniel glanced back for the first time. His expression tightened. Grace didn't look at him. The judge, an older man with a steady voice and sharp eyes, called the court to order. Papers were passed forward. Silence fell. The judge adjusted his glasses and began reading from the document at the heart of the case. The prenuptial agreement, page by page, line by line. Daniel's lawyer shifted in his seat. The language was clear, precise, unavoidable. Clause 1. All intellectual property created by or belonging to Grace Whitmore before or during the marriage remains her sole property. Clause 2. No spouse may claim ownership, partial or otherwise, of said intellectual property, regardless of marital assets. Clause 3. Any attempt to coerce, control, or financially sabotage the protected party triggers automatic financial penalties, including reimbursement of diverted funds and coverage of legal fees. Clause 4. In the event that abuse is documented by third-party evidence such as medical reports, financial records, or witness statements, the protected party may seek separate residence, sole management of her income, and primary custody without financial penalty or claim against her work. Daniel's jaw tightened. Natalie's smile faded slightly. Evelyn stood. "Your Honor," she said, calm and controlled. "We submit Exhibit A through Exhibit F supporting repeated violations of this agreement as well as separate causes for financial abuse and coercive control." Screens were turned on, videos played, the pharmacy counter, the decline card, the timestamp 3 days after surgery, the hospital room, divorce papers on a tray, Grace holding newborn twins, the nurse's incident report confirming timing and content. Natalie instructing staff to remove baby items from the house while Grace was recovering elsewhere. Margaret directing dirty mop water to be used to humiliate Grace during pregnancy. Gate logs showing Grace's access removed without any court order. Email chains from Daniel and Natalie using company resources trying to sell Reed Whitmore analytics to Vivian while describing capabilities lifted from Grace's protected materials. The room went completely still. No whispers, no phones, just the sound of truth playing out. Natalie's smile cracked. Her hand tightened around the armrest. Daniel stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "She's mentally unstable. She spent everything. The judge raised a hand. "Sit down," he said firmly. Daniel froze, then slowly sat. Evelyn remained composed. "Your Honor," she said, "we're not asking the prenup to decide everything. We're asking the court to enforce what Daniel Whitmore voluntarily signed and to weigh his conduct as documented in determining custody and financial awards." The judge continued reviewing the documents in front of him. "The court finds clear evidence," he said at last, "of financial abuse, coercion in a medical setting, and attempted interference with the protected party's lawful business interests." He looked directly at Daniel. "The prenuptial agreement is valid and fully enforceable." He turned a page. "The divorce is granted," Natalie inhaled sharply. "Restitution is ordered." The judge continued. "All funds improperly transferred to Miss Reed, under the guise of consulting fees, are to be returned to the marital estate, then allocated according to the prenup. Mr. Whitmore will be responsible for Mrs. Whitmore's legal fees." Daniel's face drained of color. Regarding custody, the judge went on. "The court is persuaded by the pattern of behavior toward Mrs. Whitmore during pregnancy, birth, and postpartum, including attempts to destabilize her financially while she was recovering from surgery." He looked at Grace now. "Primary physical and legal custody is awarded to Mrs. Whitmore." He said, "Mr. Whitmore will have supervised visitation pending completion of a parenting and counseling program, after which the court may revisit the schedule." Margaret stiffened, lips pressed into a thin line. Natalie stared straight ahead as if not moving would make the words less real. The judge closed the file. "This court will not tolerate abuse disguised as authority," he said. Grace remained still. She didn't smile. She didn't react dramatically. The room buzzed quietly as the weight of the decision settled. Then the judge looked at her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his tone shifting, "counsel has requested an opportunity for you to make a brief statement for the record. You are not obligated to speak. Would you like to?" Grace lifted her eyes for the first time. The room leaned in, and somewhere deep in the silence, something irreversible waited to be spoken. The silence shattered the moment Grace stood up. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Cameras lifted all at once. The room seemed to lean forward, hungry, waiting. Daniel felt it before he understood it. Grace Whitmore stepped away from the table slowly, her movements careful but steady. She stood tall, shoulders relaxed, hands unclenched. There was no anger on her face, no fear, no hesitation. That was what unsettled everyone. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't crying. She wasn't asking for mercy. The judge nodded once, granting permission. Grace turned not toward Daniel, not toward Natalie, not toward Margaret, but toward the press and court observers gathered at the back of the room. Reporters, cameras, recorders, people who would carry this story outside the walls. She took one breath, then she spoke. I was presented with divorce documents while recovering from surgery, Grace said evenly. My children were hours old. The words landed hard. A ripple moved through the room. Pens paused. Fingers tightened around cameras. Grace continued, her voice calm, controlled, impossible to interrupt. My access to the home I lived in was revoked without a court order, she said. My accounts were closed while I was still in a hospital bed. My children's basic needs were turned into leverage. Daniel shifted in his seat. Natalie's posture stiffened. Margaret's jaw tightened. Grace didn't look at them. My silence, Grace said, was mistaken for consent. Cameras clicked rapidly now. Flash after flash lit the room, but Grace didn't flinch. She had lived through worse than bright lights. She paused, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she chose to. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. This isn't revenge. Daniel scoffed under his breath. Grace heard it. She turned then finally and looked at him. This is accountability, she said. The word echoed. Natalie's remaining composure slipped. Her throat moved as she swallowed hard. She stared down at her hands, nails digging into her palm. Grace shifted her gaze to Margaret. For years, Grace said calmly, I was told to stay quiet, to be grateful, to endure. Margaret didn't blink. But endurance, Grace continued, is not agreement. The room was so quiet now that every breath felt loud. Grace turned back toward the judge and the press. And for the record, she said, her tone still level, still restrained. The company that licensed the algorithm I built quietly. Over years finalized a deal the day my children were born. Daniel's head snapped up. Grace didn't stop. Their internal valuation of that technology, she said, exceeds $1 billion. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A reporter whispered, did she say billion? Another dropped a pen. Natalie's face drained of color. Daniel froze. Margaret stared straight ahead, unmoving, as if her body hadn't caught up to the moment yet. Grace didn't elaborate. She didn't explain. She didn't name the company. She didn't need to. Her lawyer, the court, and Vidian's legal team had already confirmed everything off camera. Today's words were not a boast. They were a statement of fact on the public record. Grace stepped back slowly, returning to her seat beside Evelyn. Her hands rested in her lap, calm, still. The room buzzed now. Low voices, frantic typing, whispered disbelief. Daniel stared at the table. Natalie's phone buzzed once. She ignored it. It buzzed again and again. Natalie glanced down despite herself. Messages stacked across the screen. We need to pause our collaboration. Given today's ruling, we have to distance. Call will not proceed. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Grace didn't look at her. She didn't need to. The judge called for order, but the energy in the room had shifted permanently. The story no longer belonged to Daniel or Margaret or Natalie. It belonged to Grace. And as Natalie's phone continued to vibrate uncontrollably, urgently, one truth became impossible to ignore. What had started as a private betrayal was now a matter of public record, and the collapse had only just begun. The first notification hit Daniel's phone like a slap. Access revoked. He frowned, sitting in the back of a ride-share, still in the same suit he had worn to court that morning. His jaw was tight, his mind replaying Grace's words even as he tried to drown them out. The company that licensed the algorithm I built. Internal valuation exceeds $1 billion. He had barely slept the night before. He hadn't expected to lose. Another notification blinked across the screen. Accounts under review. Then another mandatory meeting. Compliance and HR. 3 p.m. Daniel's chest tightened. This wasn't supposed to touch him. This was supposed to be messy for Grace, not for him. He was the one with status, contacts, influence. He was the one people respected. He stepped out of the car and headed toward his office building. walking a little too fast, trying to look casual. The lobby felt different, quieter. Eyes followed him, then quickly looked away. He swiped his access card at the turnstile. Red light, he tried again. Red. Must be an error, he muttered. Security approached him, 2 guards he knew by name. Today they wouldn't meet his eyes. Mr. Whitmore, one said carefully. They asked us to bring you straight to the executive floor. Daniel forced a smile. Of course, he said. They probably need me to help handle the press. They rode the elevator in silence. On the top floor, he walked into the corner office that had always belonged to his mentor, then to him in all but title. The senior executive, a man who once praised Daniel for his bold instincts, sat behind the desk. He didn't stand. Good afternoon, Daniel said, forcing charm into his voice. I assume you've seen the circus. Completely one-sided. I can explain. The executive slid a plain cardboard box across the desk. Your access has been terminated, he said flatly. Effective immediately, Daniel blinked. Excuse me. Compliance reviewed the testimony and court documents. The man said. The financial abuse, the attempt to funnel funds as consulting payments, the emails to Vidian using our company signature to promote Reed Whitmore Analytics. That's my private life, Daniel snapped. You can't. You attached our logo to it. The man cut in. You represented yourself as acting with our backing while trying to profit from a technology you had no rights to. That makes it our problem. On the wall outside where Daniel's name had once been listed under future partners, there was now an empty space. His nameplate was already gone. He stared at the box, personal items, framed photos, awards he had proudly displayed. Security will escort you out, the man said. You're not to contact any clients. Legal will follow up regarding potential claims. Daniel laughed once, bitter and small. You're throwing me out over her, he demanded. Over a woman who spent her life doing nothing. The executive's face hardened. You might want to read the business news before you describe her that way, he said. It seems the market disagrees. Daniel didn't answer. He picked up the box. His hands felt heavier than the weight inside it. Security led him through the office he used to walk through like he owned it. Today, no one greeted him. No one met his eyes. Conversations died as he passed. In the reflection of the elevator doors, he didn't see a powerful man. He saw someone who had bet everything on control and never bothered to read the fine print. Across town, Natalie Reed sat alone in her car, parked in a quiet lot. Her hands shook as she scrolled. Headline after headline flashed across her screen. Court confirms abuse. Upholds prenup in Whitmore case. Consultant named in misuse of funds allegations. Shell company linked to attempted IP interference under review. She opened her banking app. AC count temporarily restricted pending review. Her laugh came out sharp and brittle. This wasn't the plan, she whispered. Natalie had always been strategic. She didn't fall into affairs. She leveraged them. She didn't attach herself to men for romance. She attached herself for access. Daniel was supposed to be a step up, not an anchor. Her phone buzzed again. Messages from numbers she recognized. Given today's ruling, we have to pause our work together. Our firm can't be associated with ongoing investigations. We wish you the best moving forward. She knew what those words meant. They were done with her. Natalie dialed Daniel's number. Straight to voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. Anger rose hot and fast. She started the engine and drove. That night, the house looked different. Not physically the same walls, the same furniture, but the energy was gone. The arrogance was gone, the illusion was gone. Daniel stood in the bedroom. Tie discarded on the floor, cardboard box on the bed. He pulled open drawers with more force than necessary. You said this wouldn't touch me, he said, his voice rough. You said we could spin it. Natalie stood near the dresser, suitcase open, clothes thrown in without care. She didn't look at him. I said we could manage it if you kept her calm. Natalie replied coolly. You dragged her into a legal war while she was in a hospital bed. That's not spin. That's evidence. Daniel slammed the drawer shut. You push this, he growled. You told me to make a statement to show her she had nothing without me. Natalie turned slowly, eyes cold. No sympathy left. I told you to win, she said. You chose cruelty. There's a difference. Daniel stared at her. You're leaving? He demanded. Now. Natalie didn't flinch. I don't stay where there's no future, she said simply. She picked up the last item from the dresser, a watch he had given her, bought with money that now tied directly to court-ordered restitution. She slid it onto her wrist. Anyway, this place was never really yours, she added. You only thought it was. She closed the suitcase and pulled up the handle. Daniel took a step toward her. You don't walk away from me, he said. Not after everything. She stopped in the doorway and looked back one last time. Watch me, she said. Then she left. Not crying, not apologizing, not loyal, just gone. The door clicked shut behind her. The sound echoed through the empty house. Daniel sat down on the edge of the bed. The quiet pressed in on him, heavier than any noise. No footsteps, no voices, no phone calls demanding his time. His phone vibrated once on the nightstand. He grabbed it. A news alert lit the screen. Grace Whitmore secures full custody. Billion-dollar licensing deal confirms her IP dominance. Below it, another suggested article. How a quiet strategist outmaneuvered everyone inside the Whitmore prenup. Daniel stared at the words until they blurred. For the first time, the truth truly landed. He hadn't lost Grace because she was nothing. He had lost everything because he never cared to see what she was building on paper in silence right beside him. He dropped the phone onto the bed and buried his face in his hands. In another part of the city, Grace was signing documents in a sunlit room, closing doors he didn't even know existed. And while Daniel sat in a house stripped of voices, allies, and purpose, one quiet reality waited just ahead. Her ending would not look like his at all. The knock came sharp and sudden. Grace Whitmore flinched, not from fear, but from habit. For weeks, every unexpected sound had carried weight. Lawyers, documents, court dates, consequences. Now, finally, it was about something else. She studied herself, then crossed the room. Sunlight poured through the tall window, warming the quiet space. The twins slept in their bassinets near the couch, wrapped snugly, their breathing slow and even. The room smelled faintly of clean linen and baby lotion. Grace opened the door. Evelyn Ross stood there, a slim folder tucked under her arm. It's finished, Evelyn said simply. The words hit with the same force as a shout. Grace stepped aside to let her in. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Evelyn placed the folder on the table and opened it carefully, as if even now the paper deserved respect. She turned the last page toward Grace. Final judgment, Evelyn said. The time to appeal has passed. All orders stand. Custody, restitution, enforcement of the prenup. The court's done. There's nothing left for him to challenge. Grace stared at the signature line. Her name was already there, printed neatly. All that remained was one last acknowledgement at the bottom. She picked up the pen. Her hand didn't shake. As she signed, the weight she'd been carrying for years loosened at once quietly, without drama. No rush of triumph, no tears, just release. Evelyn closed the folder. It's over, she said. Grace nodded. Evelyn lingered for a moment, then glanced at the twins. They'll never remember any of this, she said softly. Grace followed her gaze. No, grace replied. But they'll grow up knowing what I did with it. Evelyn smiled just briefly, then gathered her things. Vidian's rollout starts next quarter, she added. They'll handle the publicity on their side. You don't have to do anything you don't want to. Your ownership is secure with or without interviews. Grace's shoulders relaxed. I don't need billboards, she said. I just need stability. You have it, Evelyn replied. Call me for the fun contracts next time, not the survival ones. Grace walked her to the door. When it closed, the silence returned. But this silence was different. It didn't press in. It didn't accuse. It didn't demand endurance. It simply existed. Grace crossed the room and sat between the bassinets, resting her hands lightly on the edge of each one. The twins stirred, then settled again. She watched them for a long time. Her mind drifted not backward to what she had lost, but forward to what had been preserved, her dignity, her work, her children's safety. No one could rewrite that now. Grace stood and walked to the window. Outside, the day moved on without spectacle. Cars passed. Trees shifted in the breeze. Somewhere, people hurried through lives that had nothing to do with hers anymore. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel victory. She felt calm. And calm, she realized, was the rarest kind of freedom. Grace leaned her forehead lightly against the glass and whispered so softly that only the room could hear her. "We're free." Behind her, the twins slept on. The camera lingered not on wealth, not on headlines, not on consequences, but on stillness, on a woman who had been erased and refused to disappear, on a future built quietly, deliberately, and entirely on her own terms. And somewhere far away, the noise of Daniel's collapse continued without her. She didn't need to watch it. She had already moved on. Because the strongest ending isn't revenge. It's peace. I hope you enjoyed watching this story as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in my next